From life's first cry to final breath, how the narrative hymns of Getty and Townend captured the church's attention in the new millennium. Since 2001, when Keith Getty and Stuart Townend released In Christ Alone, modern hymns have gained a serious foothold in the realm of congregational music. In Christ Alone was the #1 song in the United Kingdom from 2006 to 2014. It is currently #2 in the UK and in the top 20 globally, according to CCLI. Many Getty and Townend hymns have been covered by famous recording artists. They've been published in hymnals, turned into choral anthems, and sung around the world. Yet what was it about their hymns that first captured the church's attention? At the dawn of the 21st century, churches were in the middle of the worship wars. Many had embraced rock and pop-influenced contemporary worship and praise and worship music, while others were holding on to traditional hymnody. New hymns were still being composed in the same idiom as traditional hymnody. However, there had been few attempts to bridge hymnody and contemporary praise and worship music. Keith Getty was concerned by the lack of spiritual depth in his peers, noting how they could not explain even basic doctrines of the faith. He also recognized the corresponding dearth of theologically rich songs in the 1990s. Yet the divide of the worship wars presented a problem. Those who embraced contemporary praise and worship were committed to songs of adoration and expression, wanting nothing to do with the dry theology of classic hymnody. In a personal interview, Getty said, "Things were much more binary back then. There was no middle ground. We were trying to bring everybody to the table. And so, if you take the model of hymns, storytelling hymns, we felt had a much better chance of connecting with the modern generations than, say, more strophic, didactic hymns like Immortal Invisible, God Only Wise. How you bring people from singing Undignified by Martin Smith all the way across to Immortal Invisible is a heck of a job." Getty and Townend began writing narrative hymns to provide that middle ground of theological depth and emotional connection. In doing so, they also filled the gap for biblical narrative material, which was lacking in both contemporary praise and worship and late 20th century hymnody. Their narrative hymns uniquely spoke to people in the early 2000s and are still reaching people today. Additionally, several musical novelties, including rock harmonies, musical turnarounds, and innovative song forms, increased their hymns' effectiveness and popularity. This study will analyze 3 early Getty and Townend hymns: In Christ Alone, The Power of the Cross, and Joy Has Dawned. Before analyzing the 3 hymns, first I will explain the significance of narrative hymns. Singing narratives is crucial in the church's worship. Worship theologian Robert Weber states that worship does God's story. Weber is concerned with worship enabling anamnesis, or remembrance, of God's saving acts throughout history. God's saving acts through the incarnation, cross, and ascension are remembered in the Christ hymns of the New Testament, like Philippians 2, 6-11. Thus, songs we sing today should recall the mystery of God at work in history, saving a people and ultimately the world. Narrative songs fulfill the biblical model of anamnesis, and they do so by powerfully speaking to our imaginations. James K. A. Smith argues that Christian formation happens more through our liturgies and the stories and poetry within our liturgies than by the doctrines we hear taught. He says the fundamental way we understand our world is through poetry and narrative. This is why, as Didion puts it, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. We need stories like we need food and water. We're built for narrative, nourished by stories, not just as distractions or diversions or entertainments, but because we constitute our world narratively. Smith discourses with philosophers including Ian McGilchrist and Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his important work, Imagining the Kingdom. He pushes back against the intellectualist account of action, which assumes doing follows thinking. McGilchrist has shown how cognition is actually dependent upon emotion in bodily existence. If emotion and the body are at the core of experience, then reason emanates from that central core rather than the other way around. Furthermore, Merleau-Ponty provides an epistemology of embodied perception, which counters the Cartesian account of humans as merely thinking things. Merleau-Ponty convincingly argues for a hybridity of humanity, of both mind and body. We know the world because we experience the world in our bodies, providing us with preconscious knowledge. This preconscious knowledge is shaped by our habits in the world and directs us to where to go and what to do. Therefore, Smith argues that narrative and liturgy are of primary importance in shaping us because they speak to our emotions. The way to the heart is through the body, and the way into the body is through story. Songs which recall God's mighty acts have always been biblically appropriate and powerfully impactful in worship. Yet narrative songs have the potential to be particularly potent in a postmodern culture. In Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Smith unpacks Jean-Francois Lyotard's claim that postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narratives. He explains how, on the surface, this claim makes it seem like postmodern people will not accept the meta-narrative of the gospel. Yet, he goes on to show how the gospel is not a meta-narrative because although it is a grand story of explanation, it does not also claim to legitimize itself based on an appeal to universal reason. Rather, since the message of the cross is foolishness, it must be accepted by faith. Therefore, the way to share the Christian faith in a postmodern culture is to openly acknowledge the existence of presuppositions and then narrate the story of the Christian faith. The new apologetics will look like unapologetics and will be characterized by faithful storytelling. Despite the biblical example of narrative hymns, Jesus' example of telling stories, and the emotional impact stories have always borne, not many people were writing or singing narrative songs or hymns at the close of the 20th century. For example, examine CCLI's list of top 10 songs of the 1990s on this slide. Out of these songs, the only one with any narrative is Lord, I Lift Your Name on High by Rick Founds. It was the number 7 song overall in the 1990s. The chorus of this song tells the story of the gospel, incarnation, cross, resurrection, and ascension in very simple language. Lord, I Lift Your Name on High was the number 1 song, according to CCLI, from April 1995 through October 2002. Keith Getty has noted he believes the key to its success was its simple gospel narrative. Only 4 other songs in the 1990s CCLI Top 100 contain any narrative elements. Awesome God by Rich Mullins, Because He Lives, Victory in Jesus, and How Great Thou Art. Therefore, there are only 5 narrative songs in the CCLI Top 100 of the 1990s. However, there is one 1990s narrative song not in the 1990s Top 100, which proceeded In Christ Alone in employing a poetic narrative style. Stuart Townend wrote How Deep the Father's Love for Us in 1996. When Keith Getty heard How Deep the Father's Love for Us, it moved him so much that he thought, I would love to write songs like this my whole life. When Getty and Townend began to write together, they wanted to write songs with deep theology, yet they did not merely write theologically rich hymns. They intentionally chose to write theologically rich and poetically rich narrative hymns. The first narrative hymn we will examine is In Christ Alone. Townend wrote stanza 1 about Christ bringing hope and life and strength. Yet many other songs also do the same thing. Townend says, what distinguishes this hymn is that quite often songs do begin with the effect of what Christ has had in my life. But in a sense, when you go through the story and go, this is what has happened, then that's what makes verse 4 explode. Townend beautifully recounts the story of Christ's birth, rejection, death, burial, resurrection, and reign in stanzas 2 and 3. Stanza 4 confidently rejoices in the power of Christ. One can detect similarities between Charles Wesley's And Can It Be and In Christ Alone in this slide. In Christ Alone not only emulates And Can It Be, but also many other historic narrative hymns, including Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, It Is Well with My Soul, and I Stand Amazed in the Presence, by looking to eternity in the final stanza. Next, we will consider The Power of the Cross. In a video series recorded at Abbey Road Studio, Getty shares how some people have criticized The Power of the Cross as being too heavy for church life because it deals very seriously with some of the details and implications of the story of the crucifixion. Townend then articulates the writing duo's philosophy of story songs. But it is part of that narrative genre which is so missing. Most folk songs are actually telling a story, and there is power in telling a story. You know, we do sing story songs in church, but we only sing them for the children. So I was thinking, why is it that only kids need to know the stories? Actually, we need to know the stories. And I couldn't think of a song that actually pieced together the whole of that Good Friday. Getty and Townend drew inspiration from the film The Passion of the Christ in the writing of The Power of the Cross. They were also concerned with the egotistical emphasis on the human self in communion music at the time and desired to write something that camped out on Christ's sufferings. Though it may not have served as a model for Getty and Townend, James Montgomery's Go to Dark Gethsemane is also a narrative of the whole of Good Friday. Both narrative hymns contain many of the same details and scenes from Good Friday and Easter, and both take the reader on a journey, the singer on a journey from description to participation. Finally, the fourth stanza of The Power of the Cross features another significant Townend four-stanza explosion, as Getty calls it. The third hymn we will consider is the Christmas hymn, Joy Has Dawned. When I asked Keith Getty, what is the greatest narrative hymn of all time in the English language? He responded that today, that particular day, Kristen's answer would be Once in Royal David City. He then remarked how Christmas hymns are generally better narrative hymns. What gives them a different visceral experience is that they do a better job of camping out on the humanity of Jesus. In a way, it's musically a bit like listening to someone in life who makes you laugh, who makes you want to know them more, who listens and shows vulnerability to your pain. And then eventually, he lets you know about the gospel story, rather than someone who just shoves the gospel in your face. Joy Has Dawned particularly resembles the scriptural themes of Angels We Have Heard on High. However, structurally, Townend mirrors the same blueprint he used in Christ Alone. He explains the implication of Jesus' birth in stanza 1. Then he tells the story in stanzas 2 and 3, while at the same time providing the theological significance of the story. Finally, he finishes with another powerful stanza 4. W. David O. Taylor explains that one of the great powers of a narrative is how a story reminds us that salvation is always material, geographic, particular. In the final 4 lines of Joy Has Dawned, Townend captures both the personal and cosmic nature of Christ's lordship, and he marvels in the amazing paradox that the Lord of all time and creation was born as a baby at a specific time and particular place. Now, we will briefly explore 3 musical novelties which helped these 3 early Getty and Townend narrative hymns reach a 21st century audience. Their early hymns were based on singable folk melodies, and they were crafted with flexible accompaniment for high church or contemporary settings. The melodies and musical accompaniment were indeed vital to the success of Getty and Townend hymns, but a few other factors established these hymns as truly modern. The musical novelties of the inclusion of rock harmonies, musical turnarounds as hooks, and the creative use of form helped take these potent narrative hymns and boost their popularity and effectiveness. Townend helped Getty simplify the chord structure in Christ Alone from its original 4-part chorale harmonization. While doing so, he also suggested using a borrowed minor 5/7 chord, or a 5 chord in the Mixolydian mode, in the musical introduction and turnaround. This chord has appeared in rock music since the 1990s, if not earlier, and you can see examples of its use in this slide. Most notably, the exact same progression from the instrumental section in Christ Alone is used as the main harmonic progression in Coldplay's famous song Clocks. We will listen to a little bit of both In Christ Alone and Clocks in this musical example. no, whoops, sorry. Y'all were hearing that, correct? Okay, my bad.
In Christ alone, my there in the ground.
This use of the lowered seventh scale degree differs from classical tonal harmony, jazz harmonies, and earlier 20th century pop music. It also differs from the hymn tunes Shine, Shine Jesus Shine, and Aldine, The Stars Declare His Glory. Getty and Townend also used musical turnarounds as hooks in both In Christ Alone and Joy Has Dawned. There is a signature four-measure instrumental section used as an introduction and turnaround, or interlude between each stanza. The use of a signature instrumental section gives a song a musical hook, much like pop and rock songs from Africa by Toto to Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner. Popular music scholar Don Trout defines a hook as the most memorable line or part of a song, the part that first comes to mind when one thinks of that song. Interestingly enough, the turnaround utilized in the Getty's 2011 recording of Joy Has Dawned mirrors the syncopated rhythmic hook Trout identifies as 3-3-2 and is featured in songs like Jack and Diane by John Mellencamp. Finally, we will observe Getty and Townend's creative use of form. When writing The Power of the Cross, Getty and Townend struggled to tie the narrative together, and it took them several attempts to write a chorus. They ended up settling on two choruses. Getty said, "We did the two choruses, which was a Beatles trick. The Beatles in this very room did double choruses, two different choruses, and that's where I first thought that idea would be a cool idea." Getty and Townend started writing narrative hymns at a time when the church desperately needed them. They provided theologically rich lyrics through well-crafted narratives of Christ's incarnation, life, and passion. They were following the fundamental principle that good story is good art, and they built upon great hymn writers like Charles Wesley. The Townend texts are integrally linked to the Getty tunes, which is a modern trend in worship music. Finally, although their first hymns were fashioned in traditional metrical and strophic form, they introduced musical novelties which made their hymns truly modern and helped capture the church's attention in the new millennium.